just leave?
Yeah, that's what I
You
did. I
you
just
you had
left
you
after
had
I asked
mods,
him
so
a
you could just
silly
mute them all.
question.
You could just mute them all.
So the guy was a nominalist, the guy that came in, and he was being really toxic, and he didn't want to agree to being reasonable. That he didn't have a meta ethical commitment to being reasonable. And then he started kind of like flat, like saying that he's a nominalist. Um, and I asked him, okay, so if you're a nominalist, you don't believe in an objective ontology of universals, right? He's like, yeah. Okay, so then I asked him, but you believe that everything's particular, even our concepts are merely particulars. And he's like, yeah. And then I asked him, okay, is there uh, a class or a set of things, a fixed class of things called particulars? And he couldn't answer it, which it's a
Ah,
contradiction to
oh,
their nominalist commitment to
because
denying universals.
the two things in question, let's say object A and object B, right? They're both particulars, right?
Mhm.
But don't they have something that they share? Namely that they are particulars?
Yes, right. What's the relationship? It includes a sort of a unity or a commonality.
They have even
But
particulars amongst themselves have to bear resemblance
if
to
they're
each other.
truly just particulars and they're truly unique, then they can't really be called one another at all.
Right.
Like the relationship isn't there, and so it just breaks down.
It's like, how is the same idea that you have of nominalism the same idea that I have? If they're both isolated particulars that bear no resemblance. Like, how can there be an idea of nominalism that people share if it's just particulars? You understand what I'm saying?
That true.
Yes,
That
sir.
that too. Yep.
Yeah. I usually give the argument from like the transcendental argument from being, right? If okay, if being is a particular and not a transcendental, where it's like everything has being, so it's universally in it's universally applicable but not predicated that everything has being in virtue of it being a thing. Okay? So everything in virtue of being a thing has being. If being were a particular, then that means that it's not shared amongst many things. It's only meaning that it's shared amongst one unique, isolated thing. If being is only applicable to one isolated thing, then only one thing has being or existence. That's monism,
Hmm.
right? And monism leads to Parmenides' view of change, that change doesn't exist, right? Because if change were to exist, then it would disprove monism.
It is funny. I know some people who do bite that bullet. David Bentley Hart, for example, calls himself a monist, and then he tries to get out of it through panentheism. I don't know if you're
Yeah,
familiar.
everything's just a different mode. It's just a
Yeah,
different mode, right?
yeah.
Exactly.
So, I mean, there are people who are willing to take that where it goes.
Well,
It's
it
not
leads
great,
to
but
a reductio ad absurdum, though, right? Which is change doesn't exist. Okay, you went from a state of being not convinced that change doesn't exist to a state of being convinced, therefore change exists. For you to even say that it doesn't exist, you you had a state of saying change doesn't exist, and a state of not speaking, right? So in order to say that change does not exist, in order to protect monism, you must assume that change exists. So monism leads to a logical impossibility or a logical contradiction, where it undermines its own statement, right? I think
It's performative contradiction.
Yeah, performative contradiction, self-referential contradiction, undermining your own propositions. Yeah, pretty much. And that's why I think that atheism leads to monism. It ultimately does.
A lot of
I don't.
atheists speak. There were like Spinoza, who basically was a monist. Um,
Everything is
oh,
God.
by the way, Einstein. People think that Einstein was a theist. Um, oh yeah, he said he believed in God, but he really believed in Spinoza's God, which is just this sort of primordial substance that is expressed in different modes, but really God is just this one. He's like substance monist kind of thing. And then
Right.
all of reality is an expression of this and just sort of an unraveling of this one substance. And that doesn't ground anything. That doesn't ground knowledge.
Yeah, it's
Right.
a form of special pleading to hold
I
monism.
think that this is one of the best arguments against atheism or nominalism is that it leads to monism, right? And if you're an atheist, you're either going to be a conceptualist or a nominalist. If you like are a realist about universals, I don't understand how you wouldn't be a theist,
Yep.
right? There's
Mhm.
just no other possible way that you could be anything else, right? So if you're a conceptualist, oh boy, that we don't, bro, we can get into that. That's hilarious. So universals, transcendentals exist if only in the mind, right? They don't actually exist as things in reality. Um, and that
Yeah,
means
that's
that
just subject-object dualism.
we would just say that that leads to monism as well, because apart from it's the same as nominalism. People like to say they're different. It's the same thing. Nominalism literally just believes that when we claim universals exist, they only exist as like linguistic tools, not actual things within reality, right?
Well, they'll claim it just terminates in the mind and not in the thing or the subject.
Exactly, but the conceptualists say the exact same thing.
Wouldn't they just if like a conceptualist that bases these transcendentals in their mind merely, don't you think it would prohibit them to to have knowledge of other minds?
Yes, how do you?
Well, that's
And
why
this is
some of
the
them are
actual issue.
skeptical of it.
Yeah,
Like that's why they're going to be like they'll just claim a skepticism, right? And
universals
then
exist in a logical
yeah,
nihilism.
and then
Yeah.
it'll just be it'll be becomes epistemic. So it's like they'll just have a practical realism where they
Right.
just
That's
there's a place where
Kantianism.
they just find a way to sneak realism in the back door, so to speak. So it's
Well,
like,
like,
go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say, um, there's only a short number of schools of thought on universals, right? You have like the conceptualist, then you have the trope nominalists, then you have the different groups of nominalists, then you have like Aristotelian moderate realism or scholastic moderate realism, then you have like absolute realism or strong realism, which is be like Platonism pretty much, right? You only have a few explanations of universals. If you take the Platonist view, right? Then you believe that there are like immaterial forms that account for these universals, right? But universals are they have aboutness to them. They're about things, right? So in the Platonist model, the forms are non-mental, but everything has a form. How can there be a non-mental form of a universal concept of a mind? Remember, the form is the perfect instantiation of that thing. How can there be a non-mental perfect instantiation of a mental item? That doesn't make sense, right? So, I think the best position would be to take that they are mental items, but they're not just merely mental items with anything contingent or composite or anything material. right? Because how would they retain identity over time if they were reduced to things that were in pure flux? And that just leads to the divine conceptualist model. And I think that's the most plausible model to explain universals per se, right? But yeah, I think the study of universals led me to divine conceptualism and to theism mostly. That had to help a lot with it. Reading Ed Fazier's book on it, Five Proofs for God.
Are you talking about the Five Proofs for God?
Yeah, Five Proofs for God by Ed Fazier.
That's a really good book. I think the Augustinian or the Augustine chapter goes into divine conceptualism argument. And also, I like Leibniz in his argument for the eternality of truth, which is in there.
I mean, there's just so many beautiful arguments. The idea that truth or telos has to come from a personal being, or I mean, I just have so many philosophical arguments, like the argument for objective purpose. It goes like this. Um, the whole of a thing is what gives a thing its identity, and not its parts, respectively. Um, you cannot define the parts without the whole. Therefore, the whole must exist in order to have the parts, right?
Well, you can't even speak of parts without the relation to the whole, right? In order
Exactly.
to speak of a part of something, you're already pointing to the whole, right? So
Right.
it's like it becomes a yeah, good.
And the whole is the unified structure of the parts, right? Now here's my question. If there's no objective telos or design, what basis do we have to say that something is unified or not unified or working, right? You know, when an atheist says it just works, well, doesn't that mean that something is going along with its proper purpose if it works, right? So the argument kind of goes like this. To determine if something is unified is on whether it works or not. But the basis for whether something works per se is if it's in accordance with its proper telos or endpoint or end goal, right? And if telos doesn't exist, or it only exists within the mind and not apart from the mind, then there can't be any unified object in the world, like a tree before human minds existed, right? Suppose there was a world where there was just a tree, right? It's a unified structure. If telos was only determined by our mind, then how do we know that the parts of a tree are unified? What is the basis for that? How do we know it's a whole or it has identity? I think those kinds of questions point to the existence of God in a very profound way. But yeah, like the
Yeah,
argument.
yeah.
Like,
It's
mhm.
if if universals exist, they can't be reduced to states of matter. If universals can't be reduced to states of matter, then the only way to explain their existence is immaterially.
Right.
Universals do exist. So conclusion is therefore universals exist immaterially. Um, and then I'm reading a second argument here. If universals exist immaterially, then the only way they could exist is through an omniscient mind. Universals do exist immaterially, therefore universals exist in an omniscient mind. So, because our minds aren't doing the work of the universal, enumerating every single uh, part of the whole, there's something or someone, some mind enumerating it for us so it can work in reality. And we're basically utilizing the universal mind to make the judgment.
Right. Exactly.
Is that? Are you sure about that claim? Like, because whenever you talk
The
about
last claim
the
is kind of a leap of faith,
intelligibility,
but go ahead.
yeah, well, I was going to say, whenever you're talking about the intelligibility of things, right? It's like the ability, if you deny the ability of the interior light of reason to grasp the intelligibility of things, doesn't that kind of like fall
It
into,
presupposes necessity of being, which
yeah,
you can't. Right, right. But I
okay,
mean, for
yeah,
most of it, it's pretty airtight.
but it,
That's just
By
what's
you,
called a principle sufficient reason. Ever heard of that one, Joe?
right.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
no, fair,
It just
fair.
like simply is, right?
It
We don't
just
have to
simply
explain
is.
it. Yeah, it just simply is.
But
But
it's
yeah,
kind of like
mhm.
whenever like because this is part of the argument for the immateriality of the soul, right? It's that whenever like the soul is potentially all things because it can take in these forms, right? If the form that you're taking in was matter in some way, like
Your mind would
whenever,
become that thing. That's Thomas
yeah,
Aquinas' argument. Yeah.
yep. So
It's
it's just
hylomorphism.
hylomorphism.
Yeah.
I love hylomorphism.
Basically, Thomas Aquinas' argument for the soul kind of goes like this. All things that are in this world are made up of matter and form, right?
Yep.
That's what makes it that thing, right? It's what it's made out of, the stuff behind it, and then the form would just be the blueprints or the design or the structure of said thing, right? And I think, for example, a bronze statue, right? The statue would be the form, the matter would be the bronze, right? So the argument kind of goes like this: when we are conceiving of a thing, we can conceive of the form, right? So the form enters our mind, and we're thinking about the form. But if form and matter being brought together is what makes something its identity, right? And my mind is just purely material, then when I conceive of the form of a thing, my mind would actually become that thing. That's what he's saying. Like my mind would become that thing. Like let's say I'm thinking about a dog, the form of a dog, right? Conceiving of that form, the matter in my mind and the form that I'm conceiving of come together and literally become that thing, like that identity. And I think it's an okay argument. I think it has a lot of assumptions behind it, though, that need to be justified prior to arguing it. I like Aristotle's arguments more
Mm.
in
So
De
you
Anima.
may appreciate this then. So whenever we talk of matter, right? Like no matter is without form. So it's not necessarily that matter is the stuff. It's the stuff's potency
Yes, I
to
know. It's the
take that form. Yeah,
potency. Yes, I
I
know.
know. I just thought you'd find that interesting since you're already a pedant.
I'm an Aristotelian. I know this. I read Scholastics. All right. Like, I'm
Oh,
kidding.
oh.
I don't want to be hubris, but
No, the scholastics are the best.
it depends. Depends on which Scholastic.
Well, I mean, even the like the scholastics who are in the different schools, they at least make rigorous argumentation for what they're saying, right?
Yeah.
They're all systematic in their thinking. So even when they are shown to be wrong, they're wrong in interesting ways that, that matter, right? And it isn't like an arbitrary wrongness.
Right. And I think that Thomas Aquinas is first, second, and third. No, I think his third or fourth way are very good arguments. The argument from contingency, the argument from
Motion.
efficient causality, and the argument from
Right.
change or motion.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think his argument from efficient causality is extremely good. I think Lagrange has an entire commentary on the five ways and tries to basically justify specifically the argument from motion and or change.
Yeah, motion's the
Yeah.
best. Efficient causality nowadays is Plantinga's argument.
Yeah, I think the argument from efficient causality of Lagrange kind of justified. But I think there's very good arguments for why there can be an infinite regress, like extremely good arguments. For example, distinguishing between the per accidents and the per se causal chains. I think that does a very good job at expressing the idea, right?
That you can Are you saying that you can't know from nature of the impossibility of an infinite regress?
Correct.
Okay.
I'm saying
Yeah.
that we can reason that a infinite regress, right, is not possible under a per se causal chain, right? Which would be like a subordinated causal chain, where all of the motion in said chain depends upon each other, right?
but that's going to be argument from motion and not from efficient causality.
Well, the
They're
argument from
all
causality
interrelated,
is the
right?
same thing, though. They're all interrelated.
They're all
And
interrelated, but
yeah,
there is an expression of the argument from efficient causality, and
I think the argument
there's
from
no observable
contingency
way
is
to
also very
demonstrate
good.
that it doesn't fall into infinite regress.
Yeah,
That's
there
the
is a way.
that's
Yeah,
the
there is a
paradox
way.
with Plantinga's reasoning.
No, there is a way. Because efficient causality also deals with per se and per accidents causal chains. So, like, for example, um, when you conceive of a set of dominoes, if you push the first domino and then remove it, the domino chain will keep going, right? That's what we call a per accidents causal chain, where everything in the causal chain is not dependent upon the first domino, right? But let's say simultaneously
Yeah, but it's
all of the
arbitrary. It's
one
arbitrary when
second.
you
Let's
remove the domino in
let's
that
say
example.
let's say simultaneously, what if all the causes depending upon each other simultaneously in a per se causal chain? Then it can't lead to an infinite regress because causality wouldn't exist. Because everything would derive its power and its intrinsic power from another and ultimately be interdependent upon it. So you can't remove it.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing though. Like, the first domino in that example has no explanatory power because it's arbitrary.
Well, no, it has no explanatory power in the sense that there's no explanation for its existence because it's the basis for the rest of the cause's existence.
I know in the positive statement, yeah, I mean it it doesn't matter, but
Abismal, sometimes I think you say a whole bunch of nothing, like you don't know what you're talking about, to act like you're like saying something.
okay,
Sometimes, like I
so
just
like have you reviewed Plantinga's argument?
you just told me, oh, but like it has no explanatory power. What does that have to do with like the first domino example that I just brought up?
Because like I said, I mean, so your example, right, relies on the fact that, well, we can negate the first principle of causality, right, in this example, because we could just remove the first domino and the rest of the causation would follow per accidents, right?
Yeah.
So you're presupposing, right, that we don't need a first principle in this example, right, in order to
No.
explain causality
No,
through per
because my
accidents.
my my
That's
argument
fine,
my
but it's
argument
still arbitrary.
my argument that I made was that we accepted a per se causal chain when referring to the argument from efficient causality, not the per accidents one. Like we don't when we say an infinite regress or an infinite set of causes, we're not referring to an infinite set of dominoes. That's a per accidents causal chain. We're referring to a per se causal chain, right? Which
Which is
where
going to
all the
be infinite
causes
regress of
derive
causes that there can't
there
be.
can't be an infinite regress because all of the power of the causes are interdependent upon each other.
Right, but you're still not making the reason why it wouldn't have explanatory power is because you're not making a formal distinction there at all.
Oh my god.
I'm just like I don't have a problem with the argument for from efficient causality. I'm just saying like
There's not a presupposition behind why it doesn't lead to an infinite regress. I gave the argument for why it doesn't. An infinite regress would only work in a per accidents causal chain, right? Or a linear causal chain, right? Not a hierarchical causal chain where everything in this causal chain is interdependent upon each other. A subordinated causal chain, as Lagrange says, cannot be infinite. There are very rigorous arguments that scholastics provide for this. Anyways, the argument from contingency is also a very good argument. I think that Cajetan like tipped it off very
yes.
well. as well. So
Motion and contingency are the undefeated arguments.
yeah, yeah. No, nothing can defeat that. I've never seen
And I'm
any
glad you
good
mentioned
atheist.
Cajetan as well, because not a lot of people are aware of Cajetan's thesis on it.
I love Cajetan's thesis on the five ways.
I love his
I've read them
tribunal of
all.
Martin Luther.
Ah, that's hilarious. Where you just like debunked him.
I wrote a paper on him during my master's.
Really?
Yeah, I
But
was a little bit arrogant because I didn't think it was gonna be so like there's gonna be so much reading on it.
the argument from contingency and the argument from change, as well as like the argument that Augustine provided for universals and the transcendental argument, all of those together are, I think, very, very beautiful arguments. And I think that all the scholastics were doing is that they literally were just taking the church fathers and reasoning about them to a higher order level. Like the argument for motion didn't just come from Aristotle, right, or Thomas
Right.
Aquinas. It was also mentioned in like people like Saint Gregory Nazianzus and Saint John of Damascus in the East. The argument from efficient causality was also used by Saint John of Damascus in his exposition of the Orthodox faith. Um, I would just say, like, if you read what was it? It is Saint John of Damascus in his book on philosophy. I think he was extremely Aristotelian and Neoplatonic for the doctrine of the logi. He was extremely Neoplatonist and very intellectual, very, very intellectual about the faith. He was basically a proto-scholastic of some sort, right?
Can I read what St. John says about in his first chapter on the exposition?
Sure.
Because he was very Aristotelian. There's no doubt.
About vain philosophy.
There's no debate. I'm reading a paragraph here. I'll just read the whole thing. It's not long at all. No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. The Godhead then is ineffable and incomprehensible. For no one hath known the Father but the Son, neither doth anyone know the Son but the Father. Furthermore, the Holy Spirit knows the things of God, just as the spirit of man knows what is in a man. After the first blessed state of nature, no one has ever known God, unless God himself revealed it to him. Not only no man, but not even of the supermundane powers, the very cherubim and seraphim, I mean. Nevertheless, God has not gone so far to leave us in complete ignorance. For through nature, the knowledge of the existence of God has been revealed by him to all men. The very creation of its harmony and ordering proclaims the majesty of the divine nature. Indeed, he has given us knowledge of himself in accordance with our capacity. At first through the law of the prophets, and then afterwards through his begotten, only Son, our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ. Accordingly, we accept all those things which have been handed down by the law and the prophets and the apostles and the evangelists, and we know and revere them, and over and above all these things we seek nothing else. For since God is good, he is the author of all good, and he is not the subject to malice or any affection. That's basically it.
Natural
So
theology based.
St. John is saying that we can know God exists through natural means,
Yeah,
but we
that's
always
Neoplatonism.
prioritize the law of the prophets and the apostles, and we put those above all things.
Yeah, true. But gotta love natural theology, clearly being taught. I think the recently canonized Saint Demetrius Stanieloi, glory be to God, he's been glorified. Um, he had a section that sounded just like this in his what is it? Experience of God, Orthodox dogmatic theology.
Well, I'd be curious if you want to talk about the natural theology stuff. I happen to be an atheist, and I'm a scientist, biologist by trade.